On January 12, 1948, a bitterly cold winter morning in Manhattan, a demolition ball, suspended over Riverside Drive, suddenly plummeted. It wasn't aimed at an ordinary building, but at Schwab Mansion, a 75-room palace, once considered the grandest private residence ever built in New York. When the steel ball struck the limestone, the sound was heavy, dry, and like a death sentence. What had taken 4 years and over 2,000 workers to construct began to crumble before passers-by in just a few short weeks. 40 years earlier, Charles Schwab had spent over $7 million to build it, a figure almost unimaginable at the beginning of the 20th century. He built it as an affirmation that his power, money, and status would last forever. But by 1948, no one wanted to buy it, not even the annual property taxes. The most poignant aspect of the story lies in the fact that the house wasn't demolished because it was outdated, ugly, or dilapidated, but because it was too perfect, too big, and too expensive to continue existing in a world that had completely changed. Over the next 6 weeks, Schwab Mansion was dismantled like a dissected body. The marble fireplaces were transported to a Florida hotel. The brass details were melted down and sold for metal. The exquisitely carved wooden panels, once custom-made by European artisans, were taken apart and sold by weight. A small portion went to museums or private collections, but the vast majority became rubble, silently transported away. A palace built as a symbol of eternity ended its life as a storage facility. And Schwab Mansion was not an isolated accident. It was clear evidence of a much larger phenomenon. America had proactively, systematically, and almost without hesitation demolished the most magnificent mansions of the Gilded Age. In just a few decades, hundreds of private mansions that once sprang up along Fifth Avenue in New York, on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, on Prairie Avenue in Chicago, and in the wealthiest neighborhoods of major cities have vanished. These structures, built of marble, limestone, bronze, and steel, designed to last for centuries like European castles, were demolished so quickly they didn't even have time to become heritage. Remarkably, most of these homes didn't collapse due to natural disasters or war. They disappeared because of cold, economic decisions, tax calculations, maintenance costs, and land values revealed an undeniable truth. Keeping them was no longer worthwhile. This story isn't the tragedy of a few wealthy families squandering their money, nor is it simply a matter of aesthetics or changing architectural tastes. It's the story of how a nation's relationship with money, power, and urban space changed. Those mansions were built to demonstrate that their owners had reached the pinnacle of American society, that they were not only rich but belonged to the permanent elite. But that very thing became a deadly burden as the world entered the 20th century, with income taxes, rising labor costs, and downtown land valued for its profitability rather than its symbolism. And here's the core paradox of the whole story. Building a palace is a one-time expense, however large, but maintaining one is an ever-increasing expense. Those who contracted to build Gilded Age mansions believed those two things were one and the same. In reality, they weren't. When the flow of money stopped, when wealth was fragmented across generations, and when society no longer celebrated ostentation as it once did, homes built to last forever became inescapable burdens. Their demolition wasn't a spontaneous act of vandalism, but a desperate, repeated choice made across America. The real question isn't why Schwab Mansion was demolished in 1948, but why an entire nation would allow the greatest symbols of wealth and ambition to disappear almost without resistance. To answer that, we must go back to the time these mansions were built, understand why they came into existence, and why the world has changed so rapidly that $7 million, marble, and steel cannot buy eternity. To understand why those mansions disappeared so quickly, we need to look back at the moment they reached the height of their power. Around 1900, Fifth Avenue in Manhattan was not the shopping or office district it is today. It was an avenue of private palaces, a rocky canyon, where the facades of mansions rose like ramparts, completely separating the world of the few from the life of the rest of the city. From Washington Square to the edge of Central Park, the colossal buildings stretched endlessly. The Vanderbilt family owned 7 mansions on this street alone. The Astor family occupied an entire block. Whitney, Huntington, Frick, Gould. Each name represented not just a family, but an entire economic empire built on steel, railroads, oil, and finance. European visitors to New York were astonished. London had royal palaces. Paris had the particular hotels of the aristocracy, but nowhere was the density of private wealth as high as Fifth Avenue. This wasn't the power of the state or royalty, but personal power, forged in limestone, marble, and wrought iron. Americans called it Millionaire's Row, and that name was no exaggeration. The stretch of Fifth Avenue from 50th Street to 90th Street alone had over 40 grand mansions, each worth millions of dollars at the time. They were built not just to live in, but to be seen, to send a silent message. The owners of these walls stood at the top of the social pyramid. Remarkably, the speed at which this world disappeared was almost equal to the speed at which it was created. In less than 60 years, almost the entirety of Millionaire's Row was wiped out. By 1960, on that same stretch of Fifth Avenue, the number of private mansions still standing could be counted on the fingers of one hand. Houses designed to last for centuries, with the best materials and techniques of the era, were demolished before they could even become truly historic. The demolition was eerily quiet. Each time a palace disappeared, it rarely caused a major outcry. People read the news in the newspapers and went on with their daily lives, as if the destruction of a million-dollar architectural icon was just a minor detail in the city's progress. This isn't unique to New York. Newport, Rhode Island, the summer stage of America's elite, has seen a similar process, albeit on a smaller scale. On Bellevue Avenue, once home to over 80 enormous summer cottages, more than half vanished between 1920 and 1970. Houses that were once the setting for lavish parties, where the American elite gathered to see and be seen, were demolished one by one, leaving behind empty plots of land or new structures with no connection to the past. In Chicago, Prairie Avenue, once America's most densely populated millionaire neighborhood in the late 19th century, has become a desolate industrial wasteland. In Philadelphia, Boston, and many other cities, mansion districts have suffered the same fate. This mass disappearance suggests that it wasn't the result of isolated individual decisions, but rather the manifestation of a larger operating principle. When Gilded Age mansions were built, they represented a very American idea, that personal wealth could be etched into urban space and remain a permanent mark. But the city didn't stand still, and neither did the economy. Land in the heart of major cities was increasingly viewed through the lens of performance and profitability, not symbolic value. A plot of land that once served only one wealthy family could now support hundreds of households or generate enormous revenue for businesses and the city government. When that comparison became too obvious, the palaces began to look more like obstacles than symbols. They occupied too much space, served too few people, and did not generate a cash flow commensurate with the value of the land on which they stood. In a society increasingly valuing growth, density, and functionality, the existence of a block-sized house for a single family became difficult to justify. It was here that the seeds of collapse were sown, even as the marble walls still gleamed and the halls still echoed with the music of final banquets. But to understand why those mansions were built in the first place, we must go back even further, to a time when wealth in America exploded so rapidly that society couldn't keep up. After the Civil War, America entered a period of unprecedented growth. Railroads connected the two continents, steel-built cities, and oil and finance created enormous fortunes in a single lifetime. Names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Frick were not only wealthy by the standards of their time, but wealthier than anyone in American history before them. John D. Rockefeller once held nearly $1 billion at a time when the entire federal budget of the United States was less than half that amount. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel empire for nearly $500 million. Cornelius Vanderbilt left over $100 million when he died in 1877, and his son quickly doubled that amount. However, in the social order of late 19th century New York, money didn't automatically buy acceptance. The old money families, like the Astor, Livingston, and Schuyler, viewed the newly acquired wealth from railroads, steel, and oil as crude, unrefined, and even morally questionable. They saw themselves as the true elite, not just because they were rich, but because they had been rich for generations, with their genealogies, traditions, and tight social networks. In that world, being invited to the right drawing room, the right party, was more important than any number in a bank account. Caroline Astor, considered the unofficial queen of New York society, wielded that power. She and socialite Ward McAllister created the 400s, a list of families recognized as belonging to the upper class. The number 400, according to McAllister, was because that was the number of people who could comfortably stand in Astor's ballroom. Anyone not on the list, no matter how wealthy, was considered invisible. The Vanderbilt family, despite owning some of America's most important railroads, was initially excluded. Rockefeller and Carnegie were even less welcome. They had money, but lacked the class defined by the old society. Faced with such rejection, these newly emerging tycoons find themselves in a strange predicament. They have conquered markets, crushed rivals, controlled industries, and shaped the national economy. Yet they cannot enter the ballroom of a New York widow. Their daughters struggle to marry into conventional families. Their sons are denied entry to prestigious clubs. In a society still heavily influenced by symbolism and ritual, pure money proves powerless. The solution gradually took shape, then quickly became a clear strategy. If they couldn't buy direct acceptance, they would build it. They would create structures so grand that society couldn't ignore them. They would systematically import European culture, from architecture and art to rituals, and display it all in stone, marble, and bronze. A mansion needed no introduction. It asserted its owner's status the moment others saw it. In that logic, the house ceased to be a dwelling. It became a weapon. Every facade was designed to be awe-inspiring. Every hall was a stage, where status was displayed. And when one family succeeded in forcing society to acknowledge them, other families were immediately drawn into the race. The status war was not fought with words or newspaper articles, but with the thickness of the limestone, the height of the ceilings, and the number of drawing rooms capable of holding hundreds of people. It was from this silent but brutal war that Gilded Age mansions sprang up across America, magnificent, ostentatious, and carrying within them the seeds of future downfall. Once the struggle for status was established, architecture became the only language of power that everyone understood. America's wealthiest families didn't seek out local architects in the conventional sense. They sought out those who could bring European influence to the New World. Richard Morris Hunt was the most important name during this period. He was the first American to receive formal training at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, where architecture was not just about construction, but about the display of power, order, and status. Hunt understood one thing that his clients also understood. If you wanted to be considered aristocratic, you had to live in aristocratic spaces. Under the hand of Hunt and renowned firms such as McKim and Mead and White, Gilded Age mansions are designed like miniature European palaces. French Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, Beaux-Arts, Tudor. Each style carries a system of symbols that has been tested over centuries on the old continent. These homes don't try to look modern or American. On the contrary, they deliberately look antique, as if they have existed for a long time, as if the owners' families have deep roots in Western history. This is a conscious effort to buy depth of time with money. Materials are imported from all over the world. Limestone for the facade comes from Indiana, but is treated using French techniques. Marble from Italy and North Africa is selected slab by slab for its color and veining. Crystal chandeliers are custom-made in France. Bronze is cast in classic European styles. Rare woods from many continents are used for wall cladding and staircases. In some cases, an entire room is crafted completely in Paris or Florence, then disassembled, crated, shipped by sea to the United States, and reassembled inside the steel frame of the house. These mansions are not just construction projects. They are global logistics projects. Along with the architecture, an entirely new and incredibly expensive way of life was imported intact. A palace of 70 or 100 rooms could not function like an ordinary house. It required a large staff: butlers, cooks, chambermaids, footmen, gardeners, drivers, and technicians to operate the heating and electrical systems. The soaring halls and marble staircases needed daily cleaning. The geometric gardens required constant trimming. The modern mechanical systems of the time, boilers, pipes, pumps, demanded specialized knowledge and regular maintenance. Each technological improvement, while bringing convenience, simultaneously created a new fixed cost. In the ostentatious frenzy of the Gilded Age, few stopped to ask the most dangerous question: what would happen when the flow of money was no longer strong enough to sustain all of this? Owners thought of social triumph, not annual bills. They thought of outpacing rivals, not of maintaining a massive spending machine for decades. Architecture, as a weapon of status, was pushed to extremes where beauty and grandeur were directly proportional to the level of constant dependence on money. From the moment of completion, Gilded Age mansions were not only symbols of power, but also resource-consuming machines, demanding a level of wealth equal to that of their builders. The problem is that the wealth that created those mansions wasn't something permanent. There's a fundamental difference that most Gilded Age owners don't realize, or don't want to acknowledge: the difference between a fortune and an inheritance. A fortune is a living asset, generating a steady stream of income large enough to sustain a lavish lifestyle without depleting the principal. An inheritance, on the other hand, is a fixed asset that erodes with use, especially when it's divided among generations. Those who built Gilded Age mansions were largely living in the era they possessed the fortune, but their heirs were often left with only the inheritance. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II or William K. Vanderbilt signed contracts to build their enormous mansions, the wealth behind them seemed limitless. Investments in railroads, steel, and finance generated enormous profits annually. Spending a few $100,000 to maintain multiple estates simultaneously was not a problem. In that context, operating costs were considered a minor detail, almost negligible. What no one considered was that the next generation would no longer possess the same concentrated wealth. When the founders died, their assets were divided among their children, and then further dispersed through subsequent generations. Each division reduced the ability to generate a concentrated cash flow, while the cost of maintaining the estates did not decrease. A palace doesn't shrink to fit new circumstances. It doesn't automatically reduce the number of rooms, the size of the gardens, or the complexity of its engineering systems when the owner's wealth diminishes. It still requires the same number of people to operate it, the same amount of fuel for heating, and the same amount of money for repairs and maintenance. This creates a deadly paradox. Even if the heirs are still wealthier than 99% of the population, they are not wealthy enough to sustain what they inherited. A family might own a few $1,000,000 and still not be able to maintain a mansion built for those who own tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. The trap of Gilded Age mansions lies in the fact that they were designed for a rare financial peak in history, not for a state of normal wealth, however normal by the standards of the upper class. A factory, a railroad, or a financial company can adjust its scale as the market changes. A mansion cannot. It doesn't generate profit, it doesn't produce goods, it has no adaptability. It simply consumes, year after year, regardless of the economic circumstances of the owner's family. It was this confusion between these two types of wealth that laid the groundwork for disaster. The builders believed that because they were rich enough to construct palaces, their descendants would also be rich enough to maintain them. But financial history rarely operates on such optimistic assumptions. As fortune gradually transformed into inheritance, and inheritance continued to be eroded by spending, distribution, and economic volatility, the mansions began to reveal their true nature. They were not hereditary assets, but massive money-burning machines, adorned with marble and gold, with no escape when the cash flow behind them began to wane. If the dispersion of wealth across generations was the initial crack, the emergence of the modern state was the blow that widened that crack irreparably. When most Gilded Age mansions were built in the late 19th century, America was still a country with surprisingly low taxes for the wealthy. There was no federal income tax in the modern sense. Property taxes in major cities were modest, and the inheritance of vast fortunes was virtually unhindered. The owners of these mansions believed that the cost of maintaining them would always be a fraction of the income their properties generated. They could not have known that the entire fiscal structure of the nation was about to change. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified, paving the way for a federal income tax. Initially, the tax rate was relatively low and few viewed it as a threat. But within a few years, particularly with the outbreak of World War I, tax rates on high-income earners rose rapidly. By the end of the 1910s, marginal tax rates on very high incomes had exceeded 70%. This meant that the profits from investments, which were the lifeblood of mansions, were drastically reduced before they could reach their owners. A mansion, unaware or unconcerned about the increased tax rate, still needed heating, maintenance, and operation at the same cost. Alongside income tax, property taxes in major cities have also steadily increased. Local authorities quickly realized that huge mansions were an ideal source of revenue. They were high value, immovable, and belonged to families the public believed to be able to afford. For a family struggling with dwindling cash flow, the annual tax bill for a mansion could become the biggest burden, even if they hardly used the home. Some mansions were only occupied for a few weeks each year, yet were taxed as if they were continuously generating income. The final blow in this triad is inheritance tax. When an owner dies, the family faces a huge tax burden to transfer ownership of the property to the next generation. For highly liquid assets like stocks or bonds, paying the tax is still manageable. But a mansion is different. It cannot be subdivided, cannot be sold in parts, and often there are no buyers willing to bear the entire associated cost. Many families are forced to sell other properties, even take out loans, just to keep homes they can no longer afford to maintain. In this context, Gilded Age mansions began to be punished for existing. They didn't need to do anything wrong to become a burden. Simply standing there was enough. With each passing year, the combination of high income taxes, rising property taxes, and stringent inheritance taxes transformed these symbols of personal power into massive architectural liabilities. Homes built in an era of near absolute financial freedom now had to survive in a world where the state wielded greater power than ever before over the distribution and maintenance of wealth. And in that new world, few Gilded Age mansions could remain standing, even disregarding taxes and the dispersion of wealth. Gilded Age mansions faced another, less discussed, but equally devastating structural problem: the disappearance of the servant economy. These palaces were designed for a world where servant labor was abundant, cheap, and virtually invisible. In the late 19th century, millions of immigrants poured into America, willing to accept low-wage, long-hour, and low-status work in wealthy households. For them, working in a grand mansion was far better than manual labor in a factory or on a construction site. This labor force became the silent foundation that kept the mansions running smoothly. A mansion of 70 or 100 rooms could not exist without dozens of people working there every day. They cooked, cleaned, polished marble, tended the gardens, operated the boilers, and repaired complex systems that the owners rarely understood. Every amenity that Gilded Age families took for granted was based on the assumption that there would always be someone behind closed doors, ready to solve any problem. But as the 20th century approached, that assumption began to crumble. Industrialization continued to expand, and factories, offices, and shops provided higher-paying, more stable, and less subservient jobs than domestic work. Workers, especially the new generation of immigrants, were no longer keen on living in small rooms under the roof of mansions, working long hours to maintain a lavish lifestyle for others. Labor movements and changes in social perceptions also made personal service jobs less attractive. Servants were no longer cheap, and more importantly, no longer easy to find. Labor costs therefore rose rapidly. What used to be a relatively small expense now became one of the biggest burdens. A mansion might try to reduce the number of servants, but this quickly reached its limit. You can fire a few footmen, but you can't get rid of the cook, the boiler operator, or the gardeners entirely. You can close off a wing of the house, but the heating and roofing still need maintenance. The more you cut back, the lower the quality of maintenance, and the faster the rate of deterioration. Ironically, the more these mansions try to save on labor costs, the closer they come to collapse. Uncleaned marble quickly tarnishes and cracks. Pipelines that aren't regularly inspected leak and cause serious damage. Neglected gardens ruin the entire original architectural layout. These homes weren't designed to hibernate or operate on a minimum basis. They either require constant maintenance or deteriorate at an alarming rate. By the 1920s, many wealthy families realized they lacked not only money, but also the people to maintain the lifestyle that mansions demanded. Mansions began to resemble giant ships without crews, still massive, still impressive, but each day drawing closer to irreparable ruin. In this context, the decision to close, abandon, or ultimately demolish a mansion was no longer simply an economic choice. It became the inevitable consequence of a world that had changed so drastically from the initial assumptions that had shaped the palaces of the Gilded Age. By the end of the 1920s, most Gilded Age mansions were in a precarious state, despite their outward splendor. Cash flow was weakening, taxes were rising, labor was scarce, and many families were barely surviving by closing rooms, shortening seasons, or delaying major repairs. Then October 1929 arrived, and all remaining assumptions crumbled along with the stock market crash. The crisis not only impoverished the rich, it completely destroyed the financial mechanisms that had sustained these mansions. Dividends disappeared, investment values plummeted, while taxes and operating expenses continued to fall on schedule as if nothing had happened. Within years, families who once believed they were only experiencing temporary hardship were forced to confront harsh reality. They were no longer living off investment income, but were now spending the principal of their inherited assets. Each winter that passed meant another expenditure of money to warm empty spaces. Each year of tax paid meant another portion of their inheritance being cut away to maintain a symbol that no longer provided any social or economic benefit. The mansions once built to demonstrate power now became living proof of their helplessness in the face of new circumstances. At the same time, societal attitudes toward ostentation shifted dramatically. Before the crisis, mansions were symbols of success and American aspiration. After the crisis, they were easily seen as symbols of insensitive extravagance in a time when millions were unemployed and homeless. Maintaining a block-sized mansion while slums grew increasingly crowded became difficult to justify, even for their owners. Some families closed their mansions not only because of financial hardship, but also because of fear of public scrutiny and the simmering resentment spreading throughout society. Closing it down, however, is not the solution. An abandoned mansion doesn't become cheaper. It becomes more expensive in a different way. Undetected water leaks destroy the ceilings and walls. Pipes freeze and crack in the winter. Unmaintained roofs begin to leak, causing widespread damage throughout the structure. These houses weren't designed to hibernate. They need human presence to survive. When people leave, deterioration occurs at an astonishing rate. In this context, many families found themselves in a hopeless situation. They lacked the funds to operate the mansion, but they couldn't sell it either, as no one wanted to buy such a massive property with its seemingly endless costs. Each year of delay meant a year of dwindling value, while the financial burden remained undiminished. For many, the mansion their ancestors had once considered the pinnacle of their life's achievements now felt like a heavy stone dragging them down. The 1929 crisis didn't create the problems of Gilded Age mansions, but it stripped away any remaining illusion that those problems could be overcome. From that point on, mass collapse was only a matter of time. When there was no longer any way to preserve the mansions as homes, America found another way to treat them, viewing them as material mines. From here, the disappearance of Gilded Age mansions ceased to be a personal tragedy and became an organized, cold, and economically driven process. Before the demolition ball arrived, professional salvage teams stepped in. They didn't come to admire the architecture or mourn history. They came with notebooks, measuring tapes, and price lists. Each room was assessed not by its beauty, but by the profitability of each removable part. Marble fireplaces, once centerpieces of drawing rooms where the elite gathered, are carefully dismantled and shipped to hotels and villas in Florida or California. Crystal chandeliers and brass details are taken down, sorted, and then resold or melted down for metal. Intricately carved wooden wall panels, custom-made by European artisans, are taken apart piece by piece and sold by the pound or by the foot. Items too large, too complex, or too laborious to dismantle are simply demolished on the spot. Their artistic value doesn't outweigh the labor and transportation costs. In this moment, the mansions completely lose their original identity. They are no longer the Vanderbilt family home or the Schwab Palace. They become a collection of marble, copper, wood, and steel, materials that can be converted into cash. A structure that once cost millions of dollars to build is now worth far less when dismantled. The bitter paradox is that many mansions are worth more in death than they were when alive. Keeping them doesn't generate revenue, but demolishing them brings in money immediately. The salvage industry flourished in this context, particularly during the 1930s and 1940s. Demolition. Contractors not only received money for tearing down houses, but sometimes also paid owners for the right to dismantle and resell the materials. For families exhausted by financial constraints, this was one of the few remaining options. Demolishing a mansion meant erasing the last remaining symbol of family status, but it was also the only way to end the flow of expenses and even recoup a small sum to cover debts or taxes. It's worth noting that much of this process unfolded in silence. The press focused only on the biggest names, the most famous mansions. Dozens, even hundreds, of other homes disappeared without a trace in the public memory. There was no strong conservation movement at the time, no widespread notion that these private residences were shared heritage. In the eyes of many, they were simply symbols of a bygone era, and their demolition was seen as a necessary step for the city's continued development. When the final demolition ball was brought in, the work proceeded swiftly and decisively. Limestone walls dozens of centimeters thick were crushed. Steel frames were cut and pulled away. In just weeks, structures that had dominated the urban landscape for decades vanished completely, leaving empty plots of land ready for a new future. For planners and investors, it was a liberation of space. For American architectural history, it was an irreversible loss. But at the time, the logic of salvage and demolition was too strong, too economically sound, to be stopped. Gilded Age mansions were demolished not only because no one loved them enough, but because an entire system had learned to profit from their disappearance. When mansions disappear, the next question is always, what appears on those lands? The answer is almost the same across America, and it explains why the demolition of Gilded Age mansions happened so quickly. Replacing single-family palaces are structures that can serve dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of people. Apartment buildings spring up on Fifth Avenue. Office towers replace rows of marble columns. Department stores, hotels, and corporate headquarters occupy plots once locked behind iron gates. A space once reserved for an absolute few is transformed into a lucrative space for the many. From an urban economic perspective, this substitution is almost inevitable. A piece of land in central Manhattan that once only provided symbolic value for a single family can now generate a continuous stream of income through rent, taxes, and commercial activity. Cities are growing rapidly, populations are increasing, and demand for housing and office space is booming. In this context, maintaining a block-sized mansion for a single family is becoming increasingly impractical. Even those who don't resent the wealthy must admit that land in such expensive locations can do more. This change was not only driven by investors or the government, but was also implicitly accepted by society as a form of progress. Instead of a party for a few hundred guests each year, the same plot of land can now house hundreds of apartments, where hundreds of families live year-round. Instead of a large gate always closed, the land becomes a place where thousands of people come and go every day. In 20th century logic, this was seen as a democratization of space, a more rational allocation of resources in an increasingly crowded society. This very rationality left the Gilded Age mansions without their last line of defense. They were not only expensive to maintain, but also seen as a waste of space in an urban system prioritizing density and efficiency. Structures once built to flaunt personal power were now juxtaposed, with calculations clearly showing they were suboptimal. And in a culture that values utilitarianism, suboptimality is rarely defended for long. Sadly, when mansions are demolished, very little effort is made to preserve their memory. There are no requests to reuse the facades, no obligation to preserve the architectural form, and often not even a commemorative plaque. What remains are only a few black and white photographs, some scattered pieces of furniture in private collections, and names that have gradually become unfamiliar to the people who lived on those very lands. Land triumphs over memory, not because memory is worthless, but because memory does not generate direct revenue. At the time, few saw this as a long-term loss. Cities appeared more modern, more dynamic, and wealthier on the surface. But with each palace replaced, a part of the story of how America once understood and displayed wealth vanished. Gilded Age mansions lost not just in the financial battle. They lost in a more profound shift, where the value of space was measured by its profitability and the number of people who could use it, not by the symbolism and ambition of the individuals who built them. However, not all Gilded Age mansions have vanished. A handful still stand today, and their survival raises a crucial question. What saved these structures when hundreds of others were demolished? The answer doesn't lie in their owners being wealthier, more architecture-loving, or better managers than other families. The common thread among most of the surviving mansions is that they have abandoned their original role as exclusive private homes. They survive because they have embraced something their builders never envisioned: public property. The Breakers in Newport is a prime example. After Cornelius Vanderbilt II's death, the house became an unbearable financial burden for the family. Property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs far exceeded the heirs' means, even though they were still wealthy. For years, the family tried to weather the storm by shortening the usage seasons, closing off wings, and cutting staff. But the equation never balanced. Ultimately, the only solution to save the house was to donate it to the Preservation Society of Newport County for a symbolic rent of $1 per year. In return, the mansion was open to the public, selling tickets for tours and using that revenue to sustain itself. The Biltmore estate in North Carolina took a different path, but one that led to the same result. George Vanderbilt, the builder of Biltmore, soon realized that his vast estate could not endure as a purely private residence. After his death, the family decided to open Biltmore to visitors. In 1930, transforming it into one of the first house museums of its kind in America. Instead of being a display of family power, Biltmore became a tourist destination, generating enough revenue to sustain both the building and the surrounding land. Many other mansions survived through similar transformations. Henry Clay Frick's New York home became the Frick Collection, a public art museum. That opened in 1935. Some mansions were converted into schools, hospitals, organizational headquarters, or government offices. The common thread in all these cases is a fundamental compromise. Absolute private ownership was replaced by broad access. Buildings constructed to exclude the masses can only survive when they cease to exclude. The paradox here is profound. It was this exclusivity that made Gilded Age mansions so desirable and powerful in the late 19th century. But it was also this exclusivity that made them unsustainable in the 20th century. As space, labor, and money became scarcer, society was no longer willing to maintain structures that served only a very small group. Only when the mansions opened their doors, allowing hundreds of thousands to walk through halls once reserved for a few dozen guests, did they find a new reason to exist. The surviving houses have proven an uncomfortable truth about Gilded Age heritage. Their beauty and grandeur are not enough to protect them from disappearance. The only thing that can do that is a new economic model, where cultural value is transformed into cash flow through public participation. In that moment, mansions cease to be symbols of family power, becoming common property, preserved not because someone owns them, but because society finds value in preserving them. The final part of this story isn't about the surviving marble walls, but about the lesson their disappearance leaves behind. Looking back at the entire journey of the Gilded Age mansions, from their construction as statements of power to their silent demolition, a historical paradox becomes clear. America's wealthiest families believed they were building something timeless, yet the very economic and social structures that allowed them to become rich prevented those structures from lasting. $7 million can buy marble, steel, gold, and exquisite craftsmanship, but it cannot buy a sustainable modeled to sustain all of that for generations. Gilded Age mansions were born during a very special moment in American history, when wealth was extremely concentrated, taxes were low, labor was cheap, and society still celebrated ostentation as a virtue. As the 20th century arrived, all those conditions gradually disappeared. The state expanded its role, taxes became a tool for redistribution. Urbanization demanded density and efficiency, and society became increasingly suspicious of symbols of individual privilege. In that new world, mansions were no longer relevant. They were not only outdated architecturally or aesthetically, but also in their very existence. It's noteworthy that America didn't lose these mansions by accident. Much of the time, society accepted their disappearance as logical, even necessary. Demolishing palaces to build apartments, offices, or shops was seen as progress. Few stopped to ask what the long-term cost of that decision was. When the stone walls crumbled, not only was the architecture gone, but an entire chapter in American history about how wealth, power, and ambition were erased. The mansions that have survived to this day stand as rare witnesses, but they have survived only because they have accepted a truth that their builders probably never wanted. Private power cannot preserve itself. The Breakers, Biltmore, and Frick collection exist not because their owners were wealthy enough to keep them, but because they relinquished their monopoly, allowing the public to enter and transform these structures into common property. Democratization, something once disregarded by the Gilded Age elite, is precisely the mechanism that saved their legacy. The story concludes with a haunting question, rather than a complete answer. If even America's wealthiest families cannot preserve what they build to last forever, what does that say about the nature of wealth and ambition? The Gilded Age. Mansions demonstrate that money can create beauty and grandeur, but it cannot guarantee longevity. Only when a structure finds meaning beyond the ego of its builder does it have a chance of outlasting the era in which it was created. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of these vanished palaces. Not marble or gold, but a reminder that power built on a foundation of exclusivity is fragile, and beauty can only endure when it is shared. Houses once built to prove we are different were ultimately saved only when they accepted becoming for everyone. In the collapse of the Gilded Age mansions, America inadvertently revealed a profound truth. No structure is truly permanent if it exists only to serve a minority.